Still on the search of that one true love? On the limbo in this crazy world of dating, marriage, relationships? Well, listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Relationship Podcast, your one-stop podcast for everything about relationships.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Golden State Media Concepts Relationships Podcast. I'm your host, John Johnson, and in this particular episode, I'm going to talk about monogamous relationships. In the last episode, episode 38, I talked about the concept of polyamorous relationships, which is a concept that's, and it is in practice in many places, many individuals practice it, I should say, that they have more than one partner in life. And I mean, I'm talking simultaneously. In a relationship, so here's the contrast. In a relationship in which you have one partner, being polyamorous means that you have more than one partner. And in a relationship in which you're used to having one partner, let's say when you get married and you have a monogamous relationship, let me use that term, to involve someone else in that relationship is considered taboo. And to go further, if you would involve somebody else in that relationship, it would be considered most likely an affair, and from the standpoint of the secrecy involved. In polyamorous relationships, there is no secrecy. It's about having a discussion with whoever you're considering a partner, that you want other people involved in that life of the individual who's seeking the other partnership. Now, these partnerships can work lots of different ways. Now, I'm going to get to the monogamous relationship thing, but I'm touching on the polyamorous relationships in case you didn't hear that podcast. It seeks to find that emotional and sexual satisfaction with more than one person, because I would imagine that it's the concept of that individual to say, I have many needs, and one person is not capable of fulfilling that. And if I am willing to embark upon having a life that's more fulfilling, then I should seek that with which I need, and if it's with other people, so be it. But the caveat is you must let those who you are involved with know that this is what you're doing, so it becomes above board, and it certainly challenges convention on communication skills. Because if you're in a monogamous relationship, the expectation, the understanding is that you are with that person and you do things together. You don't create other, and I'm going to use the term primary relationships just for reference. You don't create those other relationships outside of your monogamous relationship because to do so would violate the trust and the understanding of your primary partner. Well, polyamorous relationships, you do things with the understanding that they know. There is no secrecy behind it, because that's the infidelity that happens in monogamous relationship. That's the secrecy. That's what destroys the trust. And in Western relationships in which you are to be monogamous, if to have sex with someone outside of your partner, your marriage partner, would then be considered grounds for a divorce. So that, having set up the contrast here between what polyamorous is, and again, to discuss monogamy in which you have one partner. Again, podcast number 38 talks about polyamorous relationships, and I gave some references. I cited one in particular, Wikipedia. I read several other things just to give myself information on it, but I read from Wikipedia, so there's quite a bit of information there if you want to read up on it. Now, going to the monogamous relationship, now this is something I'm much more familiar with. The relationship itself, having one primary partner, I consider it much more stable for me. I'm not a person of means who can afford more than one partner, and it even states in the edict of one particular culture in which a man can have many wives, but he must be able to support all of those wives. So it's not just about going out and having a bunch of partners and just being crazy. You do have to be responsible for it. What I also emphasized in the polyamorous relationship is women also can make the choice of having multiple partners. And that's something that has not necessarily been open to women in the past. It has generally been understood that men rule. And obviously in the polyamorous case, women have as much choice and as many rights as men do in the understanding. So back to monogamy and the understanding. And I'm going to talk about the pros of monogamy, in that in the Western culture and the way we have structured it in terms of marriage, child rearing, and so forth, it favors monogamy. And polyamory is a concept, and there are many people who believe in polygamy, which is having more than one partner. And being married to more than one person is considered bigamy, and that is illegal. So that's one of the things that says no, that is taboo in our culture. But monogamy tends to favor, or Western culture tends to favor, monogamous relationships in terms of entitlements to your significant other. In that of also the child rearing aspect now, it may become very complex, and it's interesting how we get around some of those issues by having extended family members, grandparents, aunts, uncles, and things look out for our children, because they could look out for their well-being. In polyamorous relationships, oftentimes there is a commune aspect to it. So there, in which it may be a village, it could be a group of people that also care for the children and love them just as much. So, but that's in contrast to monogamous relationship, in which you have the two primary partners who are responsible for the decision making and the child rearing, and obviously the financial aspect of being in a relationship, having a home, paying the bills, car repairs, medical bills, so on and so forth, and even for tax purposes. When you think about marriage and owning a home and getting the tax breaks along with that, of course, single people get that one as well. But the entitlements that come with being with a spouse, and should be that there's a death or something of that nature, or having someone empowered to make decisions for you, some of those end of life decisions. See, that's very geared towards people who are in monogamous relationships, marriage. And if you can imagine the thorny issues that would come up if it were a polyamorous relationship, if it had to be written in contract form, it might be very, very complex to sort out some of those things. And I can't say that I know anyone who's been in a polyamorous relationship. I can just say that if things like that came up, it would be quite the contract to have to spell out who's responsible for what. But I guess maybe it's no different than writing out a will. Who knows? So that's a thought. I'm looking at the time span here, and I'm going to take a short break, and I will be right back to talk about monogamous relationships.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Hello and welcome back to Golden State Media Concepts Relationships Podcast. I am your host, John Johnson, and I have been talking about monogamous relationships. This is podcast 39. 38 talked about, and I keep referencing that because this is sort of a companion kind of thing. 38 referenced polyamorous relationships, and I'm sort of reaching back into that, and I'm drawing some contrasts, some comparisons. And for those who aren't familiar with the concept of polyamorous, and just simplify it, it just means loving more than one. And when you have a background of being in monogamous relationships, the idea of loving more than one person at a time is when you're learning about love. I mean, obviously you have many things that are attractive to you, and you go through these phases of learning about that. And sometimes it can be very painful. You know, it's the idea that you find something attractive about more than one person, and what are you drawn to? If you're already in a relationship with someone and then you find yourself drawn to someone else, well, in a monogamous relationship, you just really can't act on that impulse. You either have to decide whether you're going to stay in your monogamous relationship, and if there's any shortcomings there, you can discuss that and try to find ways around it. Now, in a polyamorous relationship, it sort of opens the door for you to follow your impulse, but with the caveat that if there is someone else that you're attracted to, then you have to let your other partners know. And it takes a different mindset to be okay with that idea. Monogamous relationships, by their nature, are designed and they're structured to have support from a particular individual, and there is strength in that. There's the idea is, consider it, if you have to report to a committee, which is the way I'm going to term the polyamorous relationship in my example. It might be very complex. It'd be very difficult to get everybody on the same page with something. But at least when you're in a monogamous relationship, you only have one person you're pretty much responsible for in terms of the relationship decisions and, and the lovemaking and activities, everything involved with that, because you don't have to have discussions with other people. And as it is with communicating these things, it's a skill. You have to work up to it. But back to my example, when you're learning about love and learning about yourself, in that aspect, polyamorous relationships certainly seem to be something that's very interesting. I mean, as a young person, you can find yourself when you've never really dated or been out, you can find yourself attracted to lots and lots and lots of different things. But as you learn about yourself when you go through the dating process, it's like sharpening a pencil. These things become more and more defined. And then when it comes to looking for a partner that meets those needs, we tend to especially in Western culture, we tend to direct ourselves to finding one person in particular. And that is the nature of having a monogamous relationship. See, in polyamorous relationships, you don't really have to sharpen that pencil to that finite point. It makes the selection process probably a lot easier because you don't have to find perfection. But I think about it in terms of when you're doing long term, it could be a challenge to, you come in and out of relationship experiences all the time. And to have various numbers of lovers and to have those conversations. Now, some people might find it very easy to do that. When you think about monogamous relationships, it's you develop a routine. And it's hard, I think, to want to include a bunch of extra things in that. But when you're in a polyamorous relationship, things are obviously a lot more relaxed. There's more choices, but you do have to conduct yourself and actually plan things, because if you're going to be with somebody on Tuesday, then you're going to go to the symphony on Tuesday with this person, and then you might go to the car races on Wednesday with another person, and you got to find time to work, and all of these things tend to cross. And and when you're dealing with human beings, these things aren't going to be perfect. It's not necessarily like weaving threads in a piece of fabric where everything's very tight and very orderly. These things tend to, when you're talking about human beings, there's things that ebb and flow. And a monogamous relationship, you certainly know exactly where the boundaries are or where the lines are. It's just the two of you, and you bounce back and forth off of each other. Human beings being what they are, things tend to spill over. And if you could imagine what that's like, it's not just enough to be in a relationship with a person and then take it out. If you have a beef with partner number one, and if you're going to take that and discuss it with partner number two, see, that has that sort of affair quality to it, because you're upset at one, then you take it and go to the other. You see, these things aren't perfect, and it really requires you having the discipline to not only be honest with yourself, but certainly being honest with other people, so that if you have a breakdown of communication, you have to work at that. You have to fix that. And that's not necessarily an easy thing to do. So again, it requires thinking about it. Monogamous relationships are much easier in that aspect. If you have challenges with your partner, you and your partner can possibly go see a counselor, see a clergy or clergy or something like that. And here's another thing. There are religious organizations that don't have a problem with polyamorous relationships. But most Western culture sees monogamy as the gold standard. And therefore, when you start talking about these other relationships sort of being included, there's the primary, and then there's this third leg. So it's like a three-legged stool. And you can imagine how when you're skating on blade skates, then all of a sudden you add a third wheel to it. So it can be awkward. And I've never been in a polyamorous relationship, but I'm discussing it from an academic standpoint. I could see why people could want it, again, intellectually speaking, but there are definitely challenges, and I'm not sure what my listener, I'm not sure what what your ideas on it, but I hope to get the conversation going and for you to think about it for yourself. Discuss it amongst your friends in an academic sense. I'm not suggesting you try it unless you are absolutely communicating with your partner that you're going to be doing that. So then and therefore, I am going to take another short break, and I'll be right back after this.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blank and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Welcome to Golden State Media Concepts Relationships Podcast. I'm your host, John Johnson. And at the end of the last segment, I started talking about the religious aspects of monogamy. And, I'm going to talk about, that's a Western religion. There are other cultures of which accept a man having more than one partner, actually more than one wife. But again, it establishes that if he is to have more than one wife, that he must be there, be very capable of taking care of them, because on Judgment Day, he will be asked that question. Western society, as I had said before, understands monogamy as being the gold standard when it comes to marriage, because there's the entitlements that come with it. And even with the understanding of common law marriage, which the discussion of that happens to be when two people cohabitate for a certain period of time, they are considered together. obviously if you're a listener to this and it's something that fits you, you'll have to read up on certain statutes, because again, when you start talking about entitlements such as Social Security and things like that, they're going to look for the gold standard of marriage. And there's even the understanding in many communities that there are living arrangements in which I'm trying to think of the term now, which they're cohabitating, domestic partners, which basically you've signed paperwork saying that you two are together. Again, that's one of those interesting concepts that I think bases itself on more so the monogamy model rather than anything else. But again, back to the religion, and I'm going to read up a little more on this because I come from a Western culture in which monogamy is the standard by which most things are judged. And if you can imagine what the religious aspect of how one could explain polyamory, and again, some people are very comfortable with it, and I'm just thinking about this as I'm speaking it, because I love being in the moment and being in that thought process. I wonder what your thoughts are. I mean, ask yourself, what comes to mind when you're thinking of this? Is this something that you would be comfortable with? Or do you know somebody who's in a relationship like that? I think we've all heard of individuals who've been in affairs, and that's a relationship, or that's an expression of one's choices in which everybody's not on the same page, meaning there's someone who's left in the dark. And when those things turn out to be public, then they can get very messy, feelings get hurt, and there's always some sort of secretive nature to those kinds of things, and we tend to shy away from it. When people do things out in the open, then there's certainly still going to be judgment about it, but for those people who are involved, it allows that they can conduct themselves however they want. If they feel like they're going to be ashamed in public, then they'll say, I don't want to be a part of something like that. And if they don't feel that there's any stigma associated with it that they can't handle, then they're okay with it, and they can deal with whatever reactions come from people. And some people are very comfortable with that aspect. And I always encourage people to understand themselves and to deal with it from their own from their own personality, rather than that of always reacting to someone else's perception of it, because it's in that in which you can have a lot of self-doubt. And when it comes to relationships, having that doubt, that's always going to throw that relationship into question. If you have a relationship that you feel very comfortable with, then be with that and be okay with that, and not have it that someone else is going to throw shade on you or make you feel uncomfortable about that. Whether you're gay, straight, whatever, it's really about the individual. And as I've talked about monogamous relationships and the support systems and the religious and everything that surrounds that, and even the tax code when it comes to monogamous relationships. I mean, imagine in the polyamorous thing, how complicated that could possibly get. I mean, I spoke of, hey, if somebody dies, you can create a will and it establishes, who gets what. But that's about the only thing I can think of that takes care of that. So anyway, I'm going to wrap up this episode of Golden State Media Concepts Relationships Podcast. Again, I'm your host, John Johnson, and I've been talking about monogamous relationships. So I hope that whatever relationship you're in, it's a wonderful one, and that it allows you to grow and explore things, and any of it, have fun in your life. And I hope you're living a good one. Until next time.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Relationship Podcast. part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.